In this video, I'm going to talk to you about this map. It's the map that got me started on all the research I've been doing about the North Wessex Way. And it shows the route from Oxford to Bristol in 1675. And it's by John Ogilby. Now, it's a strip map. In the same way that a sat-nav does today, it follows the route in a linear fashion. So you start over on the far side here at Oxford, and you follow the route up through Farringdon, through Highworth, through Blunsdon and Purton, out across the Braden Forest to Malmesbury, then out towards Luckington and on, finishing up in Bristol here. Now we're going to look more at this map in a minute, and I'm going to show you some of the fascinating details that you can find as you look closely. I'm going to talk to you about why the map was made and how it was made. So keep watching and find out more about the John Ogilby map of Oxford to Bristol and the North Wessex Way. John Ogilby had an interesting life. He was born in 1600 and was raised in Edinburgh as the son of a tailor. As a young man, he was good at performing and became a dancer, a career that was short-lived when he fell off the stage aged 18 and injured his leg. He became a soldier and served in campaigns in Europe before returning to England aged 32. He combined the logistical skills he learnt as a soldier with his love of the stage and became an impresario, running theatres in London and then later in Dublin. During the Civil War, he remained in Ireland and returned to England in 1647 and set himself up as a publisher of poetry. In the early 1650s, he discovered the truth about his family. He was the seventh or eighth son of the Earl of Airlie in Scotland. Not having much use for a seventh son, the Earl gave John to his tailor in Edinburgh. Being childless, the tailor and his wife raised John as their own. But John now found his real father was dead and that his brother was the Earl of Airlie. As the brother of an earl, he found himself raised up in society. At the restoration of the monarchy, John Ogilby was commissioned to organise a grand procession through the City of London ahead of the coronation of Charles II in April 1661. In 1666, disaster struck when he lost his publishing business and all his stock in the Great Fire of London. He realised that as the big houses in London were being rebuilt, they would need books for their library. There was a fashion for world geography at the time, so he bought maps from abroad and started to publish atlases. The king appointed Ogilby as the royal cosmographer in 1671 with the job of inventing a new way of presenting information about the kingdom. This was the start of Ogilby's work to create maps of all the major routes in the country. At that time, nobody knew how far away places were from each other. Travel distances were measured in days rather than miles. And if you were travelling somewhere, you wouldn't have had a map, you would have had an itinerary, a list of places through which you'd have to pass to get to where you wanted to get to. Ogilby selected the 100 most strategic routes in the country and set out to map those and put them in a book called Britannia, which he published in 1675, exactly 350 years ago this year. Now, on the cover of Britannia, there are some hidden clues which shows how Ogilby set about mapping these routes. He dispatched teams of 3 men to follow each of these routes. As you can see here from the illustration on the cover of Britannia, 1 man was on horseback taking notes, and the other 2 were pushing what looks like a wheelbarrow with a large wheel. This was called the Waywiser, and it measured distance, and for the first time Ogilby was finding out exactly how far it was in miles from one town to the next. The measurement Ogilby decided to use was the Statute Mile of 1,760 yards. Until then, depending where you were in the country, the length of a mile could vary from around 1,600 yards to over 3,000 yards. Ogilby took a major step in standardising the length of a mile, and this standard measurement is still used today. If you look closely at the map, you can see that each mile is marked by a number. In this case, 35, 36 and 37, as the road passes through the Braden Forest. In between each number, there are 3 dots marked along the road. These are the quarter-mile markers. The measurements produced by the Waywiser were remarkably accurate. Ogilby lists the route from Oxford to Bristol as being 68 miles long. When I replicate this on Google Maps, it comes out at 69 miles. Although it was primitive technology using the Waywiser, it was allowing people to understand distances accurately for the very first time. If you look closely at the title at the top of the map, you'll see it says this: "The Road from Oxford to Bristol by John Ogilby, Esquire, His Majesty's Cosmographer, containing 68 miles, from Oxford to Fifield, to Farringdon, to Highworth, to Purton, to Malmesbury, to Luckington, to Pucklechurch, and to Bristol." Let's take a closer look at the map and some of the interesting details that can be found. The map starts in Oxford and it shows the size and extent of Oxford in 1675. The first thing to note is that the route west from Oxford was completely different in the 17th century to the route we use today. Back then, to go west, you'd travel out of Oxford on the Abingdon Road before turning right and heading across country to Kingston Bagpues. Today, we would head west down the Botley Road and join the A420 at Cumnor, following it to Kingston Bagpues. From then on, Ogilby's route follows what is now the A420 until we reach Farringdon before heading off towards Highworth. Today, the A420 would continue on towards Swindon, but in 1675, the Swindon as we know it didn't exist. This was 160 years before the railways were even thought of. The route then passes through Coleshill and Highworth. Up until the Civil War, some 30 years previous to when Ogilby mapped the route, Highworth had been noted for its cattle market, the biggest in the north of Wiltshire. However, rowdy behaviour by the troops garrisoned in the town during the Civil War meant that the market moved to Swindon. This was followed by an outbreak of the plague, the Black Death, in Highworth, which further hastened the decline of the cattle market in the later years of the 1600s. At Coleshill, it's noted that a Lady Pratt lives at Coleshill House. This was an impressive country house which had only been built in the 1650s. Sadly, the house was completely burnt down in a fire in 1952 and the ruins were demolished. After passing through Blunsdon, the route then arrives at Purton. Today, Purton is a village on the edge of Swindon, but for most of its history up until 1675, it had been a substantial settlement, befitting its role as a stopping place on the North Wessex Way. In 1381, Purton had a bigger population than Swindon, Cricklade, Highworth and Chippenham. The Ogilby map shows Purton having two routes. One is the route up the hill and through the village, and the other is a more direct route bypassing the village to the north. This is possibly the first ever recorded bypass in history. The bypass route was probably the original Iron Age route. Where the two roads meet at the top of the map is where a track comes down from Ringsbury Camp, the Iron Age hill fort on the hill to the southwest of Purton village. The road through the village may well have been built by the Romans, who had an important settlement at Purton. It turns sharp left off the original route and heads straight up the hill before turning 90 degrees right and then running straight along the top of the hill before descending down Paven Hill to rejoin the original route. After passing through the Braden Forest, the route arrives at Garsden to the east of Malmesbury. Here, Ogilby's men noted that Garsden Manor was owned by Lady Washington. She was a distant cousin of George Washington, the first American president. They also noted the manor was enclosed with stone, and it still is surrounded by an impressive stone wall to this day. The route enters Malmesbury via Blix Hill, a road hardly used since the 1970s when the bypass was built. It weaves its way through the town, along Oxford Street, past the Abbey, along Abbey Row, and into Bristol Street before leaving the town over Trucklebridge and heading off towards Foxley. Those of you who know Malmesbury well may be surprised that the main route west out of the town for most of history was the Foxley Road, to the south of the River Avon. It wasn't until 1755, when the Farringdon to Acton Turville Turnpike Road was created, that the route north of the river towards Shurston was built, eventually becoming the B4040. After travelling through Luckington, Acton Turville, Hinton and Pucklechurch, we finally arrive in Bristol. Bristol was a thriving port. In the 1300s, it was the second largest port in the country after London. By the time Ogilby's men arrived in 1675, it was the home of the merchant venturers, who were making fortunes trading with the peninsula, that's Spain and Portugal, and the colonies in the New World. By the 1700s, Bristol was heavily involved in the slave trade between Africa and the Americas. But in 1675, it was relatively small compared to the sprawling city we know today. So that's the background to the Ogilby maps. Now I'm standing here on the North Wessex Way, the ancient Oxford to Bristol route. And if you'd been standing here in the early 1670s, you might have seen a gentleman riding past on horseback, taking notes, with two other men pushing a cart with a big wheel measuring distances. And it's now 350 years exactly since the map was published in 1675. And I think the fascinating thing about this particular road is that it remains pretty much untouched. Most of Ogilby's routes that he published have now been taken over by A roads and B roads. But this section between Purton and Malmesbury behind me has been bypassed in the 1750s by the turnpike roads. And so what you see today is pretty much what you would have seen in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, maybe without the tarmac down the middle of it. So if you'd like your own copy of Ogilby's Oxford to Bristol route, then I've scanned the original map and I've had it printed up, and they are available on the North Wessex website, North Wessex Way website, for you to purchase for £15 each. So go to www.northwessexway.co.uk. So I hope you've enjoyed this background to Ogilby's maps, and a little bit of the history of how they were produced, and a quick insight into the detail that you can find on the maps. I'll be back with more videos and more stories about the North Wessex Way very soon. Thank you very much.